Hi everyone, so as I promised for the 200 subscribers special, I will be talking about the Birchface AU that I've created a while back. Now before I get started, I do want to say that there are already some Birchface alternate universes that exist throughout the internet, although please correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen any on YouTube yet, so I thought it'd be interesting for me to place in one of my own. Also, this video will be split up into 3 different parts, specifically what would have happened before Mapleshade's vengeance, what would have happened during Mapleshade's vengeance, and what would have happened after Mapleshade's vengeance, just to explain a bit about how exactly Birchface's life was before his actual death and just sort of what exactly would have changed if he were to survive. Now let's start off with before Mapleshade's vengeance. So in this AU, Birchkin and Freckлекit would have been born to Sweetbriar and Oakstar, just because in my mind it just makes a lot more sense for Sweetbriar to be their mother than for Oakstar to have had 2 mates. And around the same time that they're born, Maplekit exists. Now, I don't really think it matters who was significantly older or younger or just anything like that, but just that they were all around the same age, and because of that they got to form a close trio of friends that continued on to their apprenticeship. Okay, so now once they become apprentices, we start seeing some personalities grow into the 3 of them. For Maplepaw, so I'm not sure how many of you guys have heard this through the Ultimate Guide, but it turns out that Mapleshade has actually had some leadership skills ever since she was really young. And this has caused a lot of cats to believe that she would actually become one of the next leaders if she were given the opportunity. Now, because of these sort of capabilities, there were certain instances where she already came off as a bit manipulative, so I guess it's a bit of foreshadowing for you. And for Frecklepaw, Frecklepaw tends to be very feisty and she loves battle, just like her father. But at the same time, she also tends to be a bit of a gossiper, and this has caused her to not only gain but also lose some friends, besides Maplepaw and Birchpaw. Oh yeah, and there's also Birchpaw. Well, when it comes to fighting, he is not the sharpest tool in the shed, but he makes up for it by being a great hunter, and besides that, he also tends to be very compassionate and kind. This has caused him to actually gain a lot of respect from cats both within and outside of the clan. Another thing to note about them as apprentices is that this was around the time that Birchpaw actually started having feelings for Maplepaw. Now, he decided that it would be best to not tell Maplepaw because the feelings were about her, and instead he decides to go tell Frecklepaw, his sister. Now, even though this is the kind of information she would typically go around spreading to other people, she decided that she was going to do her brother a favor and decided that she wasn't going to tell anyone, as long as he goes over and tells Maplepaw at some point. He agrees to this, and in fact, after the night of their warrior ceremony, he goes over to Mapleshade and he confesses that, well, he has feelings for her as a friend and more, and he hopes that if Mapleshade has those same feelings, that maybe they could perhaps be something more than just friends. Now, Mapleshade ends up being honest to him, and she says that while she sees him as a great friend, she only sees him as a friend, and she hopes that they could still keep their friendship. Now, while Birchface is a bit hurt by this, he agrees to this because he would much rather keep some sort of connection to Mapleshade, even if it's just as friends, rather than just giving it all up. Now, their first year of being warriors just kind of played out like this. Frecklewish was just kind of being Frecklewish. There wasn't really anything significant to say about her. Mapleshade was actually still impressing a lot of cats with her abilities of leadership and such. But a few months after becoming a warrior, she actually ends up meeting Appledusk, and they end up becoming mates in secret. Of course, they aren't going to really tell anyone, because, well, ThunderClan and RiverClan just kind of seem to be at war at the time. Birchface, on the other hand, tends to be a bit down in the dumps, considering that he couldn't get the girl of his dreams. And his father notices this, kind of looks down at him as a disappointment, and realizes, well, if my son can't learn anything, well, then he might as well teach something. So he decides that with the next litter of kits, which happened to include Flowerkit, he was going to get one of them to be his apprentice. So that's when Flowerpaw comes around, and he actually gains her as his first apprentice, which gains him a lot of motivation and makes him much more enthusiastic. Now, just to keep note, the trio at this point would be around 2 years old. And, so about a month into Flowerpaw's apprenticeship, and Oakstar decides that, well, this battle with ThunderClan and RiverClan, he needs to take it up a notch. So everyone from ThunderClan, we're all going to head out to Sunny Rocks, and we're all going to basically claim it as ours. Now, Birchface is not very comfortable with this idea, because, well, his apprentice Flowerpaw has barely been an apprentice for a month, so she isn't very experienced with battle. So Oakstar just doesn't really take in his idea and decides, well, she can learn through experience. So they all end up going out to Sunning Rocks, the whole battle happens, and the whole scene with Appledusk and Birchface happens, and he gets knocked into the river. Now, in this Seiyu, he actually ends up getting washed up to shore about a minute later, so Flowerpod doesn't jump in. Instead, she's the one who tries to follow the river's current and tries to find his body, and she happens to be the first one to do so. Eventually, this catches the attention of a lot of ThunderClan cats, and they all find him. And from there, Oakstar decides to immediately call off the battle, seeing how his son just might have been killed in a battle that was, in his idea, somehow just a skirmish. From there, everyone leaves. Appledusk is somewhat traumatized by the experience, and they all take Birchface's body back to camp. As soon as they arrive to ThunderClan camp, Birchface is immediately taken to the medicine cat den for Ravenwing to inspect. From there, Ravenwing looks him over and determines that one of his front limbs are broken and he happens to be unconscious. Now, because of his limited training, he can try to patch him up with certain scratches, and he could try to basically build some form of a cast for his leg. But in terms of him being unconscious, there's nothing that he can do about that, and by this point, his life is in StarClan's paws. Oakstar is devastated but knows that nothing can be done, and considering that the battle happened during the evening, everyone just goes to sleep. From there, Ravenwing first tries to patch him up, then he goes over to take a look at everyone else, and from there, everyone goes to sleep, including Ravenwing. Now, while he's asleep, Ravenwing actually gets a dream from StarClan, and from there he tries to ask them about Birchface's fate. From there, StarClan basically tells him that, oh, well, Birchface is gonna be fine, but if anyone should worry about whose life is at stake, it's you. Now, Ravenwing is clearly confused about this at first, but then he receives a vision of which he is in a forest with an assortment of trees, but the ones that are most noticeable to him are the three in the front, which happen to be an oak tree, a maple tree, and a birch tree. Now, the birch tree happens to have some roots that have probably broke at some point, and on one of the branches near the top of the tree happens to be a raven. Now, the raven that happens to be perched there decides to flutter down to the roots of the maple tree and decides to poke at the foliage there for food. Now, for some reason, the maple tree begins to tilt and fall. And before the raven can actually do anything, the maple tree falls right on top of the raven. Soon enough, the oak tree also begins to fall and lands on top of the maple tree, leaving the birch tree the only tree to be standing. From there, Ravenwing wakes up in shock, and while he can't determine many things about the prophecy, he does know that by this point, he, Oakstar, Mapleshade, and Birchface happen to be part of it, and that his life happens to be in danger. Now, from there, he immediately goes to Oakstar in order to explain to him about his dream. Now, he only explains the part in which Birchface is going to be okay, because, well, he can't tell who exactly is going to be the cause of Ravenwing's demise, so Ravenwing doesn't want to give Oakstar any ideas that it just might be him. From there, Mapleshade ends up actually seeing him later in the day, saying that she feels a little bit off. So Ravenwing tries to look her over in case it might have been one of her wounds, but it actually turns out that she's pregnant, and, well, he's the first one to know. Mapleshade, she was actually very happy about this news, thanks him, and she ends up going off with her day. Ravenwing decides that there's no need to spread the news yet, especially with this being very new, and that she could probably wait a couple of days. Now, the previous part was explaining what would happen before Mapleshade's vengeance if this AU were to happen. But this next part is now going to be about what would happen during Mapleshade's vengeance if the AU were to exist. Now, that same day that Mapleshade found out that she was expecting kits is also happens to be the same day of the gathering. So as soon as she gets to Ford Trees, she goes over to Appledusk to tell him that he's going to be a father and that she's expecting kits. He is not very enthusiastic about this idea, and Mapleshade thinks that, well, this is probably because of what happened with Birchface, but he tells her that he needs to meet up with her tomorrow night in order to explain a couple of things. So they end up meeting up, and Appledusk basically tells her that they can't be mates anymore. By this point, the relationship to him is more of a stressor than an actual happiness, and he also realizes how much his loyalty to RiverClan is actually necessary. Mapleshade is left devastated by this, and goes back to ThunderClan in sadness. The next morning comes around, and Oakstar realizes that Birchface is probably going to be in the condition that he's in for a while. So his apprentice Flowerpot is probably going to need a new mentor until at least things can get worked out. So she is given immediately to Frecklewish. Frecklewish is very happy about this, and decides to go spread the news to Mapleshade. Mapleshade just really isn't in the mood for any of this, and, well, Frecklewish decides to try to pry her open about, well, why is she all upset about this. Eventually, Mapleshade gets upset and basically bursts with the news that she's expecting kids. Frecklewish decides to pry even more about this, while being very happy about it, about who the father is. Her immediate first guess is Birchface, considering that he was the cat who actually had feelings for Mapleshade. And, well, just like in the book, Mapleshade doesn't say yes, and she doesn't say no. She just doesn't say anything. And, well, Frecklewish takes it in as a yes, and decides to go spread the news all around ThunderClan, and if possible, beyond. Mapleshade just realizes what kind of problem she got herself into, considering that Birchface is still alive. And if he wakes up, then he's gonna know. And take a good guess what happens that very same morning. He wakes up. As soon as Birchface wakes up, Ravenwing notices and decides to go over to him to explain what has happened over the past couple of days. Appledusk basically knocked him into the river. He went unconscious for a couple of days and now has a leg injury because of it. Frecklewish now has his apprentice, and Mapleshade happens to be expecting kids. And according to a certain rumor, they happen to be his. Birchface is very confused by this, knowing that he and Mapleshade are not mates and just don't have that kind of relationship to actually have kids. So something seems a bit inaccurate to him, and Mapleshade goes on later on to him, saying that no, these kids are not his, but she actually needs a favor done, because the father actually happens to be Appledusk, and if anyone finds out, she might get killed for it, and so might her kids. Birchface doesn't want this to happen, and Mapleshade is very scared at this point for her life, so Birchface decides to do her a favor as a friend and decides that he'll pretend to be the father of the kids. Mapleshade is very happy about this, and throughout the next couple of months, they try to work out some kind of a relationship while basically getting ready to have kids. 2 months after this happens, Large Kit, Patch Kit, and Petal Kit are born, causing much happiness for Mapleshade, Birchface, Frecklewish, Oakstar, and for the rest of ThunderClan. As the kids get older, many of their clanmates begin to suspect that the kids do not resemble their parents as much as they would expect, especially Birchface. He goes on to defend the kids, saying that many of the skills that he has would be skills that the kids would need to learn later on, what could take months for them to know. Ravenwing finds this defense to be a bit suspicious, but he lets it slide by, not thinking much of it. By the time the kids are 2 months old, Mapleshade and Birchface decide that it would be for the best for the kids to check out the forest for the first time. From there, Mapleshade makes the suggestion that they should check out the RiverClan border. While walking along there, we notice that there is a RiverClan patrol on the other side, which happens to have Appledusk. Mapleshade ends up giving a dirty glare to Appledusk while they walk by, and while the kids seem to be very confused as to what's going on, Birchface decides that it's just best to move the group along in hopes that nobody would notice. While the group is still outside of ThunderClan, Ravenwing is inside of the Medicine Cat den, when he suddenly receives a sign from StarClan in which a small stream enters his den with 3 pieces of water reed. At first he is a bit confused as to what this means, but as soon as he puts the pieces together, he realizes that the small pieces of water reed represent Mapleshade's kids, and that the father is not Birchface, but in fact a Tom from RiverClan. He decides that it's best to represent this information to Oakstar, as their lives may possibly be in danger, considering the prophecy that he just had about Mapleshade a few months back. Oakstar is infuriated by this information, and as soon as the small group returns from their trip, he immediately calls for a clan meeting, which confuses everyone. From there, he begins to explain about the sign that Ravenwing had, and immediately asks Mapleshade who the real father of the kids was. Mapleshade lies about this and immediately says that it's Birchface, as she doesn't know who else it could have been. Oakstar begins to explain that water reeds are from RiverClan and RiverClan only. Therefore, the father of the kids would actually be from RiverClan. From there, after a bit more confrontation, Mapleshade eventually spills the beans that yes, the father of the kids happens to be Appledusk, but why is that important by this point? Everyone is infuriated by this information, especially Frecklewish, who ends up attacking her. Birchface immediately separates the 2 she-cats, being surprised as the 2 of them were once close friends. From there, Oakstar decides that the punishment that Mapleshade and her kids will receive is exile. This is infuriating to Birchface, and immediately begins to defend them, saying that they felt more like family to him over these past few months than Oakstar had ever been to him, and while these kids may not biologically be his, he would care just as much about them whether or not they were his. This is very surprising to Oakstar, and determines that, well, the kids can stay, but Mapleshade still has to leave. Mapleshade becomes furious with this new information and blames Ravenwing, Frecklewish, and Birchface for this. Ravenwing for spreading around lies that weren't necessary, Frecklewish for not defending her in her time of need, and Birchface for separating her from her kids, which she claimed she loved the most. From there, Birchface begs Oakstar to let her stay, but before anything could be done, Mapleshade leaves, causing a great sadness for him and the kids. While Birchface and the kids end up grieving over the loss of Mapleshade, Birchface decides to take the kids under his wing fully, while Mapleshade goes around committing the crimes that she would have within the novella. When Ravenwing ends up being killed, the Medicine Cats decide it's best for him to be taken to ThunderClan camp in order for them to know, and everyone ends up grieving for him, as he was the only Medicine Cat alive at the time. From there, Birchface looks over at his claws and realizes something that sends a chill down his spine. Mapleshade was the one who murdered him. This ends up making him realize that she's becoming more of a threat than he expected, and immediately brings this information to Oakstar. From there, he decides to put up more patrols around ThunderClan in case anything like this were to happen again. A few days later, Frecklewish and her patrol go around Snake Rocks in order to find anything suspicious, in which Mapleshade decides that it's her time to strike and ends up attacking Frecklewish. From there, an adder gets the best of her, and unfortunately she loses sight and ends up dying the very same day. Birchface ends up having a lot of grief because of this, and so it does Flowerpaw, considering that Flowerpaw was her apprentice and that Birchface was her brother. From there, Oakstar decides that it's best to let the both of them grieve for a while, and then decides that, considering that Flowerpaw only needed her warrior assessments done before becoming a warrior, Birchface would be in charge of that. Birchface, despite his legs still needing to be healed for a while, decides to take on this challenge considering that not much work would need to be done, and that he wanted to spend more time bonding with Flowerpaw, especially after the death of Frecklewish. Throughout one of the assessments, Mapleshade decides that she needed to strike one last time in order to get back at Birchface, the one who separated her from her kits, according to her. From there, she ends up attacking Birchface knowing that, well, he's very vulnerable because of his leg, and decides to do nothing with Flowerpaw. Immediately, Birchface tells her to go back to camp and not look back. When she does that, she immediately gets the attention of Oakstar, which wasn't expected, and in the middle of the Sandy Hollow, Mapleshade and Birchface continue on to fight. Before Mapleshade can throw the killing blow at him, Oakstar ends up arriving and fights with Mapleshade. This fight ends up leading on to the point where Oakstar and Mapleshade both end up throwing a killing blow at each other, which kills off both of them. Since Mapleshade only had one life, she immediately goes to the Dark Forest, but Oakstar had a few more lives on him, so he ends up getting revived. From there, Birchface ends up taking him back to camp, and from there, Oakstar decides that since Flowerpaw was the one who saved him, it's best that she were to become a warrior. From there, she is given the name Flowerwish after her deceased mentor, Frecklewish. From there, Oakstar grabs a few warriors, and they decide to bring back Mapleshade's body back to camp to have a proper funeral, to everyone's surprise. From there, Mapleshade's kids end up having a lot more grief and shock, and begin to question Birchface about why their mother had to go through this. From there, he decides to explain the truth about who Mapleshade really was, her being mates with Appledusk, and how Appledusk was biologically their father, and the fact that she was the one who murdered Ravenwing and Frecklewish. This causes the kids a lot more surprise, but much more understanding as to what has happened. And from there, they try to get through the burial. After that, Birchface begins to realize about what his position in ThunderClan needs to be, realizing that ThunderClan now has no Medicine Cat, and that his leg would probably never heal properly. From there, he ends up confronting Oakstar about this, saying that once his kids become apprentices, he wants to become ThunderClan's next Medicine Cat. Surprisingly, Oakstar ends up agreeing to this. From there, Birchface decides to balance out his life the next 4 months by spending time with his kids and also heading out to different clans in order to receive training from different Medicine Cats about how to be a Medicine Cat. And by the time his kids actually become apprentices, he is able to become ThunderClan's next Medicine Cat. By the time Pine Star's choice happens, he ends up getting a younger brother, and they end up forming a close relationship. And by the time Goosefeather's curse comes around, he actually becomes the mentor of Goosefeather before he ends up passing away from old age. So yeah, everyone, that is Birchface's Loss, the Birchface AU. I'm really glad that you guys were able to hear through it. Also, I plan on doing a series in which I talk about more things like this about warrior cats, and if anyone has any suggestions, I'd be really glad to hear them. Besides that, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next video.